Well, good morning again. We've been joined by an unusual guest this morning, and I'll draw your attention to this plaster bust sitting next to Maya Kubra and the projector on this front table. This is a life mask of a man named Hal Chisum. And I didn't notice it until now, but he bears a remarkable resemblance to our provost. His own formal education amounted to only 3 months, but Hal Chisum was the epitome of the educated man. He delighted equally in the forge and the lyceum. He was a great teacher because he was a great lifelong learner. Hal Chisum taught blacksmithing and wrote poetry at North Dakota Agricultural College. Born in 1851 in Chazy, New York, Chisum was held out of school on account of poor health, but oddly began helping his father in the smithy. Subsequently, he apprenticed with another smith, got a job in the locomotive shops of the Central Vermont Railway Company, cast his first vote for Ulysses S. Grant in the election of 1872. He held several other jobs, started a family, settled a while in South Dakota, and came to Fargo to work in the shops of the Northern Pacific Railway. 1902, the year the NP moved the shops over to Dilworth, Chisum became an instructor at NDSU, where he served until his retirement in 1937. This was a fortunate match. Blacksmithing was a common study for students at the AC, and Chisum's students remembered him as a teacher not only of skills, but also of wisdom. Snorri Thorfinnsson, an Icelandic lad who went on to a distinguished career in extension, wrote to Chisum in retrospect, "While I was not much of a hand at ironwork, when I took work under you, I have always felt that I learned 2 lessons that stayed with me: the dignity of labor well done, and an appreciation of art." Chisum insisted that his ironwork was no mere utilitarian pursuit, but rather a matter of artistic fulfillment. He kept a commonplace book, that is, a book in which he wrote sayings and observations, which now reposes among his other papers at the Institute for Regional Studies, North Dakota State University. Among the jottings of Hal Chisum is the statement, "I have never regretted a dollar spent for loveliness." Some other commonplaces from the pen of Hal Chisum. "To sit idle when you feel you should be doing something is the hardest thing in the world. Work is love made visible. Much time and money are spent for so-called higher education, but many recipients of this higher education never accomplish anything with it outside the drawing room." Chisum believed that those who were inclined to be bookish needed to learn the dignity of labor with their hands. Those who worked with their hands needed to learn to regard their work as art and to appreciate poetry. Thus, he had something to teach everyone, something he continued to learn all his life. At lyceums and literary events on campus, there was Chisum, and he had questions. Frequently, he was called on to compose and recite poems to commemorate significant events at the college or at his church, First Methodist. Among Chisum's commissions of ironwork is the great gate that stands at the southeast entrance of the university. He also fashioned the ornamental gate that stood in front of Teddy Roosevelt's cabin on the Capitol grounds, and the trowel used to lay the cornerstone of the Capitol in 1932. In 1931, the college faculty awarded Chisum an honorary degree, Master of Artisans, saying he has elevated the art of craftsmanship into ironworking into a fine art. Had to retire in 1937 on account of deafness, no doubt induced by his work at the forge. 1941, the college community convened for a grand honorary dinner and for observances in the Little Country Theater upstairs in Old Main, where a quartet sang the Anvil Chorus, after which Chisum and the others adjourned to the Lyceum. After the death of his beloved wife Mary in 1931, he lived with his daughter Anna until 1951 when the old Smith died. Now late in life, he wrote, and I'm identifying with this stanza more and more. I hear them say he's passing fast, and what they say is true. I'm not the man they used to know in 1892. 'Twasn't so very long ago they called me hale and strong. They found me ready night and day to tote my load along. My place beside the anvil true I filled with honest pride. My hands ne'er shrank from the hardest tasks by daily needs supplied. If you listen to those stanzas, you can hear the hammer in them. And if you reflect upon the life of Hal Chisum, master of artisans, you can achieve a good understanding of what we've come to call the land grant ideal. At home, alongside my desk, I have a great old trunk that my dear cousin Bernice gave me. She told me Grandpa Isern received the trunk as a gift and packed his stuff into it just before he caught the train for Manhattan, Kansas, to attend the Farmer's Short Course commencing January 3rd, 1905. According to the Kansas State Agricultural College catalog of that year, the short course was taught on a different plane than the regular term, more concrete, less theoretical. The work is intensely practical, so the college said, and the short course was taught in winter when farm work is more slack. Admission requirements: be at least 18 years of age and of good moral character. Although English was my grandfather's second language, he was conversant enough to get along. Now here are some of Grandpa's textbooks. A physics text, and Principles of Plant Culture by E.S. Goff of Wisconsin University. What surprises me a little is to find among them Sir Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake, and a book of Washington Irving's sketches. It surprises me only a little bit, because the agricultural colleges, such as KSAC, were never confined to teaching about crops and livestock. They always provided, as their congressional creators said, liberal and practical education. Well, oh my, here's Grandpa's composition book. It has a few physics equations in the back, along with some handy recipes for dosing horses. But mostly, it contains the lecture notes he took and brief quotations he evidently was expected to commit to memory. Now, this was just the short course, remember, but it looks like Grandpa absorbed a good bit of Oliver Goldsmith, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Washington Irving, Robbie Burns, Matthew Arnold, William Shakespeare, Benjamin Franklin, Walter Scott, and, bless his heart, the historian Thomas Carlyle. Here's a quick quiz that I gave to my nieces, graduates of Kansas State University. Can you name any of the works of these authors your great-grandpa read in college? Perhaps instead you'd like to try a few math problems from the assignment sheet Grandpa folded into his composition book. If two horses weighing 1,200 pounds each can just pull a load of 4 tons on the level, how many horses will it take to pull it up a hill, rising 1 foot in 10, 600 pounds being taken as the limit of a horse's strength? Raise your hand. All right, try an easier one. With an evener 4 feet long, how will you place the hitch in order to give the horse 1/8 of the advantage? And this was the short course, remember, taught on a different plane. By now, I hope you've taken my point about the ideal of the land-grant university. The land-grant college, now land-grant university, is a glorious American invention like nothing else in the world. It was an idea that originated with the democratic zeitgeist of antebellum America, attained actuality with the Republican dominance of the Congress during the Civil War, and is credited by historical memory to Senator Justin Morrill of Vermont. the father of the land-grant university system, author of the MORRILL Act of 1862. That act famously promised subsequent generations of Americans a liberal and practical education in a whole new class of institutions of higher education. More specifically, the land-grant ideal comprises two essential elements, the first of which is access. The MORRILL Act threw open the heavy gates of college to the sons and daughters of farmers and laborers who never before in history could have aspired to higher education. This is why the historian Earl Ross has described the land-grant college as democracy's college. Second essential element of the land-grant ideal has to do with curriculum. Agriculture was the sine qua non. But studies in the land-grant colleges, Senator Morrill explained, comprehended not only instruction for those who hold the plow or follow a trade, but such instruction as any person might need, with the world before them where to choose, and without exclusion of those who might prefer to adhere to classics. The union of these two elements is the land-grant ideal, an ideal of empowerment and inclusiveness. Historian Alan Nevins concludes that the assumption behind the land-grant movement was that liberty and equality could not survive unless all men had full opportunity to pursue all occupations at the highest practical level. No restrictions of class, of fortune, of sex, or geographical position, no restrictions whatever should operate. The assumption of which Nevins writes is not a plan or even a map. It is an ideal. And it is a fine example of what historians have come to call agency. Historians of agency, and I am one, reject the idea that history is driven merely by deterministic forces. Historians of agency say we make our choices and we live with the consequences. A person exemplifying agency in history, such as Justin Morrill, believes that it might just be possible to form a more perfect union through the equality of opportunity afforded by access to higher education and by choice of curricular options. As heirs of Justin Morrill, we inherit not only his ideal, but also the agency implicit in it. No restrictions, Nevins says. The possibilities are as wide open as our prairies of yellow and green. Now, the past few paragraphs have drawn me into the philosophy of history, which happens to me more and more these days, as my resistance to such philosophical digression grows daily weaker. And yet it may be worthwhile to be self-conscious and explicit as to how the habits of a historian may extract meaning and, dare I say it, wisdom from the land-grant university experience. Begin with the observation that history is one of the humanities and has little to do with social science. Historians who fancied themselves social scientists are responsible for the loss of untold millions of travelers lost in blind alleys. There are no predictable cycles in history, nor are there any definite dialectics. History is not moving us inexorably toward the kingdom of God, the socialist worker state, or the triumph of liberal democracy. History doesn't give a damn where it's going. History, in a word, is chaos. If you're familiar with chaos as theory, then you know that this does not mean there are no meaningful patterns in history. It just means the patterns are so long and loopy and multidimensional that we will never be able to discern them. This is why history embraces narrative as its explanatory mode. Meaning comes from the discernment of connections, one thing leading to another. This narrative way of doing history is wonderfully compatible with chaos theory, which takes account of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Where good historians today differ from chaos theorists is that whereas history and chaos don't give a damn where things are going, we do. A historian who embraces agency, who insists that human events are not mere products of deterministic forces, will point out that some of those apparently random but consequential turns of events so dear to chaos theorists, in fact, are willed acts. Someone had an idea, perhaps we might posit the idea of the land-grant university, and acted, and the consequence was history. Which brings us to another essential doctrine of good historians, contingency. Historians of the past were fond of chapter titles like The Road to the Civil War, as if that road were graded and marked in advance, and there was no other path possible but the one that led to Armageddon in blue and gray. On an occasion like this one today, such historians might insist it was logical and irresistible that the little land-grant colleges of the 19th century would evolve into the big land-grant universities of the 21st. The story to be told then would be a matter of rationalizing who and where we are now. This development, I say, was by no means inexorable. Any number of events, either random or willed, might have taken things in a different direction. There's one more historical doctrine I need to add to the toolkit before proceeding, which is the conflation of history and memory. History, as Carl Becker famously observed, is not the events of the past. It is rather the memory of things said and done, emphasis added. Some things we forget or choose to forget, and some things we remember or choose to remember. What we remember, we arrange into meaningful patterns that are the basis of judgment and identity. At the beginning of this talk, I chose to remember Hal Chisum, thereby making him history. I did so because we might emulate his good judgment, and because by telling his story, we might define who we are as people of the land-grant ideal. Let me highlight for you the latter function I just mentioned, the formation and cultivation of identity. Good stories are beautiful and useful things. As William McNeill observes, such stories constitute a myth history that brings us together and defines who we are. Benedict Anderson elaborates how such a body of narrative, disseminated and highlighted, can constitute an imagined community. That's an imagined community, not an imaginary one, meaning a community constituted as a willed act, constructed of ideas and stories that makes possible greater willed acts on the part of the community so constituted, possibly the community of a land-grant university or of land-grant universities. Such must be the purpose and function of a gathering like this today. The genius and resilience of the land-grant university derives from willed acts on the part of historical persons exercising agency in moments of contingency. This is not to say that external circumstances, be they spatial, societal, economic, or political, are unimportant. Earlier, recall, I spoke of the land-grant college as emerging from the democratic zeitgeist of antebellum America. By this I mean, during the 1840s, 1850s, with the democratization of American public life, there arose demands for what came to be known as industrial education. That is, education for the masses, the sons and daughters of farmers and laborers. American conceptions of industrial education differed from those institutionalized in the nations that otherwise served as academic models for the United States, those being Britain and Germany. Agricultural colleges there were focused on making better, more scientific farmers. With the Brits, it was tillage. With the Germans, it was chemistry. But either way, the point was the specific improvement of crop husbandry, not the general improvement of farmers. American reformers, on the other hand, consistently propounded what they called liberal education for and by farmers and laborers, which begs the question, what the heck did they mean by liberal education? Now, close reading convinces me that the reformers knew what they were talking about, and it corresponded rather well with the ideals propagated by Henry Newman, Western civilization's wisest commentator on the ideal of a university. The reformers desired to make farmers and laborers better farmers and laborers through training in specific practices, certainly. They also wished to impart to them scientific knowledge so they would be intelligent workers, not automatons, and lifelong learners, we would say today. The reformers went well beyond this, however, embracing the ideals of Cardinal Newman when they spoke of liberal education. They wanted farmers and laborers not only to produce more, but also to live better. Farmers and laborers should live fulfilling personal lives through the understanding of nature, books, and art. And they should lead responsible public lives, able to read critically, speak effectively, exercise judgment. Most influential exponent of industrial education was Jonathan Baldwin Turner of Illinois. Now, this is well and good, but nevertheless limited in scope, for the proponents of industrial education never quite grasped the idea of equality of opportunity and advancement by merit that were coming to characterize America the way Tocqueville described it. They spoke of appropriate liberal education for farmers and laborers, as though such education should be different than that for gentlemen, should not attempt to incorporate options beyond the social station of the students. Industrial education, so envisioned, was constrained by stubborn conceptions of social class hierarchy. Justin Smith Morrill of Vermont brooked no such constraint. Did I mention, by the way, that he was the son of a blacksmith? Some partisan historians have accused Morrill of merely appropriating Turner's ideas and writing them into legislation. Indeed, the phrase liberal and practical education that Morrill wrote into the Land-Grant College Act of 1862 was lifted directly from Turner. But there was this fundamental difference between Morrill, on the one hand, and Turner and Company on the other. Morrill proposed colleges for the sons and daughters of farmers and laborers, but he did not propose to train happy workers content with their stations in life. He embraced what one historian has called the culture of aspiration that would transform American higher education. The first thing, as Morrill saw it, was to get the students into college. The second was to let them study any darn thing they wanted, whether liberal or practical, and because existing colleges had only the liberal and not the practical, make sure that matters agricultural, mechanical, and military had prominent and respected places in these new colleges of democracy. It is an initial condition of the highest significance that Senator Morrill conceived a mission for land-grant colleges that was one of empowerment and aspiration rather than one of constraint and hierarchy. This was, however, but the first of several points of contingency whereby historical actors exercised agency to shape the development of the land-grant university, and specifically the land-grant university is manifest here on the Great Plains. At least two other key points had to be addressed during the formative years of the land-grant colleges on the Plains. The first of these was whether to follow the Wisconsin model or the Michigan model in the situation of the land-grant agricultural college. Wisconsin had chosen to add the agricultural college to the existing state university, what we could call the flagship, the University of Wisconsin. Michigan, on the other hand, had chosen to create a new freestanding institution to be its land-grant college, Michigan Agricultural College. Of all the states of the Great Plains, only Nebraska and Wyoming adhered to the Wisconsin plan. Nebraska, evidently out of conscious emulation of the Wisconsin model, and Wyoming, it appears, partial to a generally restrained approach to the establishment of institutions of higher education. All the other states follow the lead of Michigan, resulting in the establishment of freestanding agricultural colleges, including Kansas Agricultural College, which my grandfather attended, now Kansas State University, Oklahoma A&M, later Oklahoma State University, where I earned my PhD in, you might have guessed, history, and North Dakota Agricultural College, which I have served now for 20 years. Historical cynics may argue that the proliferation of freestanding agricultural colleges on the prairies was a manifestation of the scramble for political spoils, which resulted in the attempt to create state institutions for as many towns as possible. There's some merit to this interpretation of events, but my reading is that it lays too much to acquisitiveness and not enough to aspiration. The land-grant ideal was endangered if subordinated to the flagship universities. NDAC, like the other freestanding land grants, was an expression of the producerist values of prairie people. They wanted what Senator Morrill had described and promised. This is to say, the prairie people knew what they wanted in general and acted decisively in accord with these general wishes. But nevertheless, struggles ensued as to the mission and curriculum of the land-grant colleges. Startup was a problem in all states. There were academics who were skilled in liberal learning, and they knew how to run colleges, but they lacked either knowledge of farming or enthusiasm for agricultural studies. There were people with knowledge of farming and producerist values, but they didn't know how to run colleges. Mighty battles ensued, the two sides indicting and objectifying one another. But in the end, here's how things shook out. The agricultural colleges settled into missions and curricula that largely fulfilled the mandate for liberal and practical education encoded by the MORRILL Act. Now, land-grant historians generally miss the point as to how this came about. The curricular battles were mere sounding brass. The battle for the land-grant ideal was won by the students who invested the land-grant colleges. They were, generally, the sons and daughters of farmers and laborers, and they demanded what was promised them, a real college education, fitting them for work and for life, whatever their aspirations. They bought into the idea of a college degree as the ticket to upward mobility and the good life, and they insisted their degree be from a real college. Soon they clamored for changes in institutional names to reflect the broader mission of their schools, and eventually all such calls prevailed. Agricultural colleges became state universities, or became state colleges first, which became state universities, with some variations in terminology among the states. Significant moments of contingency for the land-grant universities transpired again in the years following the Second World War, with two circumstances posing challenges. First, there was the advent of mass education, meeting pent-up demand and rising aspirations. The veterans availing themselves of the educational benefits of the GI Bill were but the advance guard of a larger legion, their children, the baby boomers. This prompted accommodations by the land-grant colleges and by their campuses to house people and programs. I do not only refer to the Quonsets they installed on their campuses to house people and programs. I love Quonsets. I revere them for the historical functionality. But for some reason, modern university presidents just hate them. Now, more important, the land grants generated an impressive array of programs across the disciplines, and including graduate programs to serve their eager constituents. Now, the other challenging development at the same time was the rise of the modern research university, and the land grants differed in their response to this challenge. The Cold War and industrial capitalism, together and separately, posed research and development imperatives that were best met in a democracy by research universities. Most of the Great Plains land grants, although not necessarily expeditious about expanding beyond their traditional strength in agriculture, entered into the transition fairly readily. The great exceptions, regionally and nationally, were the so-called baby land grants of the Northern Plains, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana. Policymakers in these three states, assessing their prospects, foreseeing demographic and economic decline, and feeling a need to tighten their belts, were reluctant to participate in the proliferation of graduate programs, the investment in research infrastructure, and the overall expansion of higher education that would have made them players in the new order of R&D. This constituted a deliberate choice to practice retrenchment rather than become competitive. That choice had consequences in the manner of self-fulfilling prophecy. The states of the Northern Plains possessed impressive political clout. Whatever they asked for, they got. Military bases, agricultural commodity programs, transportation expenditures, infrastructure of all kinds. What they could not ask for, and therefore did not receive, was R&D money. They had no research universities to make use of it. This failure of imagination is the unacknowledged shortfall of leadership on the Northern Plains in the second half of the 20th century. It is only in the past decade that we have closed the gap toward the establishment of modern research universities up and down the plains. Thus, the record of the Great Plains land grants, although overall exhibiting good resilience, is checkered. And once again, they face a moment of significant contingency. In the early years of the 21st century, circumstances are opportune for the redevelopment of the Great Plains. These transformative circumstances are most pronounced in North Dakota, the state which previous to the current era saw the most severe economic and demographic decline, but they obtained to a promising extent throughout the Great Plains as a region. These are the four pillars of regional redevelopment. First, long-term prosperity for agriculture. Think about that. Did you ever hear that before? Increased demand due to higher standards of living in much of the world, particularly on the Asian Pacific Rim, has elevated commodity prices, including agricultural commodity prices, to a new plateau. Now, yes, we have heard this sort of thing before, but this time it is not Earl Butz saying it for ideological reasons. It is expert economists and informed farmers saying it and acting on their own projections. Second, intensive development in the energy sector, particularly petroleum. With current technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, and with additional technological advances certain, the production potential of known formations is huge, and that of formations as yet unassessed is literally unfathomable. Third, an established and burgeoning knowledge industry. Both public and private initiatives have made up for the uninspired leadership of previous generations and leapfrogged the Northern Plains into an enviable position for R&D and for intellectual leadership. This element in regional redevelopment requires assiduous attention, but as a regional driver, it is just as potent as food and energy. Fourth, for the first time in a century, a positive brand. When the Wall Street Journal declared the advent of the North Dakota miracle, it was an unwarranted mystification of what was going on. There are concrete reasons why positive developments are piling up capital on the Northern Plains. It's not a miracle, but it is a startling transformation that has captured the attention, not to say envy, of commentators across the country. The question now is, have we the perspicacity, the initiative and the commitment to channel these advantages into the greater consummation of the vision of Justin Smith Morrill. Sensing the rising tide of democratic aspirations in his time, Morrill raised his own sights even higher, deploying distinctively American institutions of higher education both to answer and to elevate the culture of aspiration. This was leadership of a visionary and foundational sort. Can we match that vision today? Throughout our society, are we capable of the conversant citizenship of Hal Chisum, or even the everyday courage of my grandfather getting on that train with his trunk? I think that at the grassroots, the answer is yes. We are that good. What is yet to emerge is leadership in the academy and in the commonwealth of the integrity and vision demonstrated by Justin Morrill. Godspeed that development, and I believe Justin Morrill would say, God bless our land-grant universities in these transformative times.